The howl of the wind was the only sound that greeted them as they staggered from the wreckage. The sand stretched out in every direction, a vast, endless ocean of gold, blinding under the unrelenting sun. The air was thick with heat, pressing down on the survivors like a suffocating blanket. They were stranded. No water, no shelter, and no hope. Keep moving. Vrixa's voice cut through the haze of exhaustion, sharp and commanding. Her alien features, tall and angular, with skin like polished obsidian, gleamed under the sun. Her species, the Caldari, were known for their endurance, but even she was struggling. The heat on Corliss 7 was unlike anything they had encountered, and yet it wasn't the temperature that worried her the most. That it was the desert itself. That no species can survive on this planet without advanced technology. None, she had insisted from the start. As the head of the expedition, she had spent years studying the desert planet's brutal ecosystem. Theories, data, endless simulations, all pointed to the same conclusion. The Caldari had seen other species perish under the planet's unforgiving sun. Now, they were next. The crew was a mix of aliens from across the galaxy, each with their own unique abilities, yet none could withstand the ravages of Corliss 7. They had crash-landed here after an unexpected attack, and what little hope they had left was rapidly fading. Their ship was nothing more than twisted metal and broken systems, a reminder of the war that had brought them here and the bitter, unforgiving truth. Survival on this planet was impossible. That Vrixa's sharp gaze scanned the horizon, but there was nothing but the endless dunes. A flicker of doubt gnawed at her, but she swallowed it down. She would not falter. Not yet. The others were more than tired. They were broken. Elon, a feeble-eyed Tisher from the northern reaches of Ilar, had long since given up. He could barely move anymore, his limbs stiff from dehydration, his lips cracked and bleeding. Arlik, the Sharka warrior, stood stoically by his side, his massive form a symbol of strength. But even his normally unshakable resolve was starting to fray. Vrixa took a step forward, her boots sinking slightly into the soft sand. She had known this would happen. She had known it from the moment they set foot on this cursed world. She had warned them all. Now it was too late. She pulled out a small device from her pack and activated it. The screen flickered, showing a series of calculations that made her stomach tighten. There was no hidden oasis, no secret source of water beneath the sands. The readings were unequivocal. The planet had long since dried up, its rivers, lakes, and seas swallowed by time and the sun's relentless heat. The desert was all that remained. That a cold wind swept across the dunes, biting at her exposed skin. She looked back at the others, trying to focus on something other than the sinking feeling in her chest. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, Vrixa. We can't go on like this, Elon rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes were hollow, the spark of life dimming with each passing hour. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. You must. We all must. But in her heart, she knew the truth. Elon wasn't wrong. The desert had claimed every other species foolish enough to challenge it. It would claim them too, sooner or later. The heat, the isolation, the lack of water. It was only a matter of time, and then, as if summoned by the desert itself, a shadow appeared on the horizon. At first, it seemed like a mirage, an illusion created by the shifting sands and the blinding sun. But as it drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was humanoid, walking toward them with slow, deliberate steps. Vrixa froze, her breath catching in her throat. She squinted against the harsh light, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. A human, the last species she expected to find on Corliss 7. The human's face was covered by a dark scarf, but there was something about his posture, his gait. He wasn't staggering or desperate like the rest of them. He was calm, composed, as though he belonged here. In this hostile wasteland, how could anyone survive here? Vrixa's mind raced. She had never seen anything like it real. Arlik muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Vrixa said nothing, her mind working furiously. No species could survive here. not without advanced technology. And yet this human, this solitary figure, walked as if the desert was nothing more than a challenge to be conquered. Who was he? And how had he survived? The figure emerged from the dust like a phantom, his gait unwavering, as if he were accustomed to the merciless desert. The crew watched in silence, their dehydration, their hopelessness momentarily forgotten as they took in the strange sight of a lone human, surviving in a place that had already claimed the lives of far more seasoned species. Vrixa stepped forward, instinctively taking the lead. Her Kaldari senses, honed through years of survival in unforgiving environments, were on high alert. Every movement, every sound in the desert felt amplified here. This was no place for anyone, let alone a human. She studied the figure as he drew closer, noting the worn, yet sturdy boots he wore, the makeshift gear slung over his shoulders, and the tattered scarf that concealed most of his features. His clothes were simple, practical, suggesting he was no stranger to hardship. "Are you real?" Arlec's voice broke the stillness. Low but filled with incredulity, the human didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the group with a mix of wariness and curiosity. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of a crude weapon, something not much more than a sharpened piece of metal. But his posture remained casual, unbothered by the stark desert heat. "That I'm real." The human finally spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "And you're not in a good spot." Vrixa's brow furrowed. "We've been stranded here since the crash. Our ship is gone. We are dying of thirst." The man gave a slight nod, as though he'd expected that answer. "No one survives Corliss 7 without more than luck. Not without water, and certainly not without understanding the planet." "Then how are you still alive?" Vrixa demanded, her voice sharp. "You should be dead." The man gave a dry laugh, the sound grating against the oppressive silence. "It's all about adapting, and understanding the land beneath your feet." Vrixa narrowed her eyes. "I have studied this planet for years," she said. "There is no water, no source. Corliss 7 is a desert, and it has been for centuries." He shrugged. "People say the same thing about Earth, but we've managed to survive there. Same principle. You learn to read the land. The signs are all around you." Vrixa's mind raced. She was a scholar, a teacher. She understood the rules of science, of biology, of ecosystems. She had analyzed Corliss 7's environmental conditions. Every study pointed to the same truth. No life could thrive here without advanced tech or hidden reserves. It was impossible, and yet here he was. "Alive, where did you come from?" she asked, her tone a little less demanding, more curious now. "Crashed years ago." The man's gaze turned distant, and for a brief moment, Vrixa saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it regret? Pain? He blinked quickly, masking whatever emotions threatened to surface. "Found a way to survive. Learned to use tools. Primitive but effective." "How?" Elon croaked from behind her, his voice rough and weak. "How can we survive? You don't look weak. How did you manage?" The human gave a faint smile, but it was neither kind nor mocking. It was a smile born of experience, of endurance. "You have to know how to find water, how to collect it, where to look. Most importantly, you have to know how to use what you've got, anything you can find. There's always a way." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Vrixa wanted to believe him, but the skepticism that had shaped her entire life kept her on edge. Could it be true? Could he really know something that had escaped her and every other expert's calculations? "And you've been here, how long?" she asked, though the question already felt like an intrusion. "Long enough." The man took a step closer, his boots kicking up a small cloud of dust. "Long enough to know there's no time to waste. I've been through this with other people. They thought they could just wait for rescue. Thought they could survive without adapting." He looked at them, his gaze settling on Vrixa. "You'll die if you don't learn to think differently." Vrixa's lips pressed into a tight line. She wasn't one to be lectured, not even by a survivor of this desolate world. But the fact remained. He had survived where others, even the most advanced species, had not. That alone demanded attention. And yet, there was still something she couldn't quite place about him. The calm, the ease with which he spoke of death, of survival. It was unsettling. "But we need water," she said, her voice finally steady. "Can you help us?" The man's eyes glinted in the harsh sunlight. "I can show you where to find it," he said. "But don't think it's going to be easy. Nothing on this planet is." Vrixa hesitated. She wasn't one to place her faith in strangers, especially not in a place like this. But the decision was no longer hers alone. Her crew was weak, dying under the sun's oppressive gaze. They needed something, anything, that could give them a chance. With a slow nod, she finally said, "Show us." The man turned, without a word, and began to walk away, his steps sure and steady in the shifting sands. The crew followed hesitantly, unsure of whether they were following a savior or a fool, and yet, Vrixa couldn't help but feel a strange sense of hope. Faint, but growing. Perhaps, against all odds, they had found the one thing that had eluded them, a way to survive. The wind tore across the dunes, a furious, whirling force that kicked up sand in every direction. It seemed as though the desert itself was angry, resentful of their intrusion, but the human, the enigma who had wandered into their path, kept moving without faltering. His name, Jack Carson, he had said, and with it came the promise of a chance at survival. Vrixa had not believed in miracles, and yet there was something about Jack's quiet confidence that pushed her to follow him. His survival in the unforgiving desert was nothing short of a mystery. It made no logical sense. But the alternative, remaining stranded with no hope, was far worse. They marched in silence, the desert swallowing up their words, leaving only the sound of their footsteps and the creaking of strained bodies. The crew was exhausted, barely clinging to consciousness under the suffocating heat. Vrixa's skin felt as though it was burning from the inside out, and yet she pressed on. There was no turning back now. Jack had led them into the heart of the desert, to a place she knew only in theory, a region where the sands were deep and shifting, rumored to be void of anything but death. And yet, Jack moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the land with an alertness that seemed more instinctual than learned. It was as though he could read the desert itself, seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. They had been walking for hours, the sun low but still fierce, when Jack finally stopped. He turned, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes glinted with a knowledge Vrixa couldn't ignore. "It's here," he said, voice rough but unwavering. Vrixa felt a jolt of uncertainty. This was it, the moment where they would find out if Jack was truly their salvation or just another false hope. She glanced around, seeing nothing but miles of sand as far as the eye could see. There was no sign of water, no oasis in sight. It was all an illusion. Jack crouched down, brushing away the loose sand with his hands. He moved with methodical precision, revealing what seemed like nothing more than a set of ancient markings etched into the ground. Vrixa stared at the symbols. At first, they seemed meaningless, abstract patterns carved into the earth. But Jack's fingers moved deftly over them, tracing the lines in a way that suggested familiarity. "This is a map," Jack explained, his voice low, almost reverential. "An old one. You wouldn't find it in any databanks, but it's real. This place was built before the desert swallowed it whole." Vrixa knelt beside him, studying the markings. A map? A map hidden beneath the sands? It was absurd. Her training, her years of research, all of it told her this was impossible. Yet Jack seemed certain. "This isn't a map," she said, shaking her head. "This is a burial ground. Nothing lives here." Jack didn't respond at first. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a tool that looked crude, nothing more than a jagged rock affixed to a stick. He slammed it against the ground, forcing a small section of the desert floor to give way with a dry, cracking sound. And then something extraordinary happened. That a slow trickle of water emerged, seeping from the ground like an ancient secret. It was dark and murky, but it was unmistakable. Water. Vrixia's breath caught in her throat. She had expected dust, stone, maybe even a mirage. But not this. Not water. The others, who had been lingering in the background, rushed forward. Elon, weak and delirious from thirst, dropped to his knees and cupped his hands, drinking greedily from the trickle. Arlik, his usual stoic demeanor cracked by the sight, looked at Jack with wide-eyed disbelief. Impossible, Vrixia muttered under her breath. Jack gave her a knowing look. Nothing's impossible if you know where to look. She studied him, this human who had somehow defied everything she knew about Corliss 7. He had found something that no one should have been able to find. Water. In the heart of a desert that had been written off as lifeless for a moment, there was a flicker of doubt in her. Could it be true? Could the theories she had built her entire career on be wrong? Could a human, with no more than his wits and a handful of primitive tools, be the one to outwit the desert? Jack turned away, continuing to dig with his primitive tool. The others gathered around him, forming a loose circle, their eyes fixed on the small pool of water now spreading slowly across the ground. Vrixia watched them, a quiet sense of awe creeping over her despite herself. Jack had done what she thought was impossible. He had found a way to survive in the unrelenting desert for the first time since their crash. She allowed herself to entertain a single thought. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Let it flow, Jack said, his voice soft but firm. You've got to learn to work with what you've got. And as the water continued to seep from the ground, Vrixia realized that Jack had done more than find water. He had shown them a new way to survive. But even as hope flickered to life in her chest, one question gnawed at the back of her mind. How much longer could they trust this man? And what price would they have to pay for this? The water, though murky and foul, had been enough to keep them alive for now. Jack had assured them that this was just the beginning, that they could survive Corliss 7 if they knew how to look. Vrixia, though skeptical, couldn't deny the truth in his words. They had been desperate, and now, for the first time, they were finding a fragile thread of hope still. The desert was a cruel teacher, and even water couldn't erase the harsh reality that surrounded them. The heat was relentless, and the sand beneath their feet seemed to stretch out into infinity. Each step felt heavier than the last, each breath more labored. But they continued. Following Jack's lead, he moved with an eerie confidence, as if the planet itself had revealed its secrets to him. Every step he took was deliberate, every motion measured. He didn't waste energy, he didn't waste time. Vrixia found herself watching him, with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. How had he learned to survive this way? And why had he chosen to reveal this knowledge now? You said this place was once inhabited, Vrixia said as they trudged through the ever-shifting sands. She had asked the question several times before, but Jack had always deflected, offering only vague answers. This time, her tone was more insistent. Jack glanced at her over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. It was, he said simply, long before the desert claimed it. Vrixia's curiosity only deepened. What happened to them? To the people who lived here? Jack didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the horizon, as though searching for something on the wind. Finally he spoke, his voice low. They were like you, like all of you. They thought they could conquer this place, that they could bend it to their will. They didn't understand the planet. They didn't learn from it. So, the desert took them. Vrixia felt a shiver run down her spine. The desert, she knew, was a force that didn't forgive mistakes. It had claimed entire civilizations before. The planet was a master of attrition, eroding all who dared to challenge its will. But Jack wasn't deterred by the planet's wrath. In fact, he seemed more at home here than anywhere else. His every step seemed guided by something deeper than survival instinct, something that Vrixia couldn't quite place. That it was hours later when Jack finally stopped. The air around them had grown thick with heat, the sun now hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dunes. Jack dropped to his knees in the sand, brushing away the layers of earth and dust with practiced ease. Vrixia, still standing at a distance, watched him carefully. There was a rhythm to his movements, as though he were performing a ritual. Slowly, he cleared the sand, revealing an opening beneath, a small, darkened crevice in the earth. "What is this?" Vrixa asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "An entrance," Jack replied. "To something much older than you realize." The others, who had been trailing behind, gathered around, their faces a mix of awe and fear. Jack reached into his pack and pulled out a small, crude light source. He ignited it, the flickering flame casting an eerie glow over the group's faces. As he peered into the darkness below, Vrixa stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The hole wasn't just an opening. It was a doorway, leading into a chamber buried deep beneath the sands. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What could this place be? A relic of the past, perhaps, or something much more sinister. "Are we going in there?" Elon's voice trembled from behind her. He was weak, his face drawn with exhaustion, but the sight of the opening seemed to galvanize him. Jack turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "You came here for water, didn't you? You can't survive without it. But there's more to this planet than just survival." Vrixa felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "More?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. "What do you mean?" Jack's eyes flickered with something dark, something that hinted at knowledge far beyond what he had revealed so far. "There's a reason the planet is empty. A reason the desert claims everything it touches. This place wasn't always like this. It was once a thriving civilization. But he paused as though the words were heavy on his tongue. "They unlocked something they shouldn't have." Vrixa frowned, instinctively stepping closer to the entrance. "What did they unlock?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the opening in the sand, his face grim. "You'll see for yourself." Without another word, he ducked into the darkness, disappearing from view. Vrixa hesitated, her mind racing. What was he leading them into? What could possibly be hidden beneath the sands of Corliss 7? Something so powerful that it had destroyed an entire civilization. There was only one way to find out. With a final, resolute glance at the others, she followed Jack into the darkness. The cold air that met her was a stark contrast to the searing heat outside. The tunnel was narrow, winding deep into the heart of the planet, and as they descended further, the sense of ancient power seemed to grow. It was as though the very walls of the passage were pulsing with an energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "We're not alone down here," Jack muttered from the front, but Vrixa's heart skipped a beat. There were no other living beings on Corliss 7. The desert had claimed them all. "Jack," she began, her voice trembling. "What's down here?" Jack didn't turn around. "You'll find out soon enough." The air grew colder as they descended further into the darkened passage, the flickering light from Jack's crude lantern casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The faintest hum of energy seemed to pulse through the stone beneath their feet, vibrating in the marrow of their bones. Vrixa couldn't shake the sensation that the walls were watching them. Listening, Jack led the way, without hesitation, his movements precise, as if he knew this labyrinth of tunnels like the back of his hand. The others followed, reluctant yet drawn to the promise of what lay ahead. Water, survival, answers. "What is this place?" Vrixa asked, her voice tight with both awe and apprehension. Her words seemed to echo unnaturally, reverberating off the walls like the cavern itself was alive. Jack didn't answer at first. Instead, he paused before a large, ancient door embedded in the stone, its surface etched with intricate symbols and glowing faintly with a strange, bluish light. He ran his hand over the door almost reverently, as though it held some kind of secret only he could understand. "This is it," Jack said softly. His voice was low, almost reverential. "The heart of Corliss 7. Vrixa stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something about this place, a weight in the air that made her skin prickle. It wasn't just the mystery of the desert. It was something deeper, older, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for eons. "What is this heart you speak of?" she asked, but Jack remained silent. Instead, he knelt before the door and, using the crude tool he had carried, began to work at the edge of the stone. The group watched in tense silence, the seconds stretching out like hours. Finally, with a grinding noise, the door shifted, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Jack stood, brushing the sand from his hands, and motioned for them to follow. Vrixa hesitated for a moment, scanning the passage ahead. It was narrow, winding, and dark, but there was no turning back now. They had come too far. They had come for water, for survival, but this place, it felt like something far more important than mere survival. It felt like the key to unlocking something that had been lost for centuries. With a deep breath, she nodded to the others and stepped into the passage. As they moved through the tunnel, the air grew colder still. The walls were lined with glowing symbols that seemed to shift and move, an ancient language she couldn't begin to comprehend. The passage was claustrophobic, pressing in on them from all sides, but Jack moved with purpose, never faltering. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast chamber, a cavern so large that it seemed to stretch beyond the reach of their light. At the center of the room stood an enormous structure, a kind of altar, with towering columns carved from the very stone of the planet itself. The entire room was bathed in an ethereal glow, coming from the walls themselves, as if the stone was alive with energy that Vrixa's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary place. It was as if the planet had been hollowed out to create this sacred chamber, a monument to something far beyond their understanding. Jack moved toward the altar, his expression unreadable. This is where it all began. This is where the ancients unlocked what they shouldn't have. Vrixa stepped closer, her eyes scanning the intricate carvings on the altar. What did they unlock? She asked again, her voice rising with urgency. She could feel the weight of the question pressing on her chest. Jack turned to face her, his eyes darkened with something that looked almost like regret. They unlocked power. The power to control the planet itself. To bend the desert to their will. He paused, his gaze lingering on the altar, as if recalling something painful. But the power came at a cost. It always does. The desert, Corliss 7, wasn't just a world. It was a living entity. And when they tried to control it, they destroyed themselves. Vrixa's mind raced. The implications of what Jack was saying were staggering. This wasn't just a planet. This was a sentient force, a being of immense power. The ancients had tried to control it, to harness its energy. And in doing so, they had doomed themselves. What happened to them? Elon asked, his voice a rasp as he staggered forward, the gravity of the situation sinking into Jack's eyes hardened. They paid the price. The desert claimed them. And now, the desert is claiming you. Vrixa recoiled slightly, but Jack's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The desert was not a simple geographical feature. It was a living, breathing force, and it had no mercy for those who sought to manipulate it. What do you mean by claiming? Vrixa asked, her voice tight. You mean to say this place is cursed? Jack's gaze darkened. Cursed isn't the right word. It's a trial, a test. The planet gives what it takes. If you can't understand that, it destroys you. Vrixa's mind spun with the enormity of it all. There was more to this planet than they had ever imagined, more than just sand and dust and death. There was power here, raw, ancient, and dangerous. Jack stepped toward the altar, his hand hovering over the stone. You can leave now, he said, his voice low. But the desert will take you in the end. It always does. Vrixa's heart pounded in her chest. She had been right to be skeptical of Jack's motives, but now it was clear. He was offering them a choice, not just of survival, but of something much deeper. They could leave, return to the surface, and let the desert claim them like it had claimed so many before them. Or they could face the trial, risk everything, and try to harness the power of Corliss 7. That the choice was theirs, but Vrixa knew one thing for certain. No matter what they decided, the desert would never let them forget this moment. It would change them forever. The air inside the cavern grew thick with an oppressive weight, as if the very walls themselves were pressing in on them. Vrixa stood frozen at the edge of the ancient altar, staring at the symbols carved deep into the stone. They pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly energy, and she could feel the hum of power vibrating in the marrow of her bones. The desert outside was a world of sand and desolation, but here, in the heart of Corliss 7, the very air seemed alive with ancient forces. Jack stood beside the altar, his fingers still hovering over the stone, tracing the glowing symbols that covered its surface. His expression was unreadable, as though he were communing with something beyond their comprehension. His silence spoke volumes, and Vrixa could feel a knot of unease tightening in her chest. "Jack," she said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "What exactly is this place? What did the ancients do here?" Jack didn't look up, but his lips curled into a thin, bitter smile. "They tried to control it," he murmured. "The power of Corliss 7 itself. They thought they could bend it to their will, manipulate the desert, reshape the planet. They sought immortality through mastery over the land." Vrixa's mind reeled. She had known the history of Corliss 7, how it had been a thriving world before the desert consumed it. But she had never heard of such a thing. Power to control the planet, to reshape it. What happened to them? Elon's voice came from behind her, trembling with a mix of curiosity and fear. Jack's eyes darkened as he turned to face them, his gaze cold. "They unlocked something ancient, something beyond their understanding. A power so vast it consumed them. It wasn't just the desert that destroyed them. It was the price they paid for trying to control something they couldn't even begin to comprehend." The weight of his words hit Vrixa like a physical blow. The desert wasn't just an environment, it was a living force, a consciousness, something far more complex than anyone had realized. And the ancients had tried to conquer it. They had tried to bend it to their will. And in doing so, they had unleashed something that had turned the planet against them. But the question remained, what had they unleashed? What had they discovered in the heart of Corliss 7 that had cost them everything? Vrixa stepped closer to Jack, her voice low and insistent. "What exactly did they unlock? What are you not telling us?" Jack hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with something like regret, but his expression remained steely. "They unlocked the heart of the desert, the life force of the planet. Corliss 7 is more than just a rock in space. It's a living entity, an ancient being. The ancients tried to control it, to harness its power, and they paid the ultimate price. The desert turned on them, and their civilization was wiped out in a matter of days." Vrixa felt a chill run down her spine. She had never considered the possibility that Corliss 7 was more than just a lifeless world. It had always been a place of death, a barren wasteland with no hope of life. But Jack's words, they changed everything. What now?" she asked, the weight of the question settling over her like a shroud. "What happens to us? What happens to anyone who tries to take control of this place?" Jack's eyes were dark, filled with an ancient sadness. "The desert doesn't forget. Once you've touched its power, once you've unlocked its secrets, you're bound to it. Forever." The words hung in the air, and Vrixa felt a cold shiver of understanding settle deep in her gut. There was no escaping this. They had come too far, seen too much. Whatever the ancients had unleashed, whatever power lay buried beneath the sands, it had chosen them. They were part of something far larger, something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. That Jack's voice broke the silence, softer now, as if he were speaking to himself more than anyone else. "I've seen it happen before. Those who try to control it, they never leave the desert. They become part of it. The desert takes them in, and they are never seen again. The price of trying to bend the land, it's not something you can ever escape." Vrixa turned to face him, her mind whirling. "And what about you? You've been here for years. You've survived." Jack met her gaze with something like bitterness. "I didn't try to control it. I learned from it. I became part of it. The desert, it shows you the way, but only if you're willing to listen. I survived because I accepted that I would never control it. I understood that the land is its own master." Vrixa's heart raced, and she swallowed hard. This wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. This was a choice between power and surrender. The desert offered them a chance, but it came at a cost none of them had fully understood until now. That we have to go back, she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at her insides. We've learned enough, but we can't stay here. Not after what you've told us. We're not ready for this. Jack looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable, before he nodded. You can leave if that's what you choose. But the desert doesn't let go easily. Vrixa turned to the others, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. The choice was theirs, but in the back of her mind, she knew that there was no real escape. They had already crossed the threshold, and the desert would follow them. As they turned to leave, the ancient chamber seemed to pulse around them, alive with a silent energy, as though the planet itself was watching them, waiting. They had been touched by Corliss 7, and there was no turning back, and no matter where they went, the legacy of the desert would follow.